With our next section of the Belgic Confession, we come to Articles 25 and 26, and we get into something in Article 25 that maybe is a topic we don't think all that much about or even see as that important, but one that was important enough for the writers of the Confession to include it, because it does have a big impact on our Christian faith. And that topic is how Jesus fulfills the law. What's the relationship between the Old Testament and New Testament? Now, in some ways, that may seem to be a little bit odd. I mean, after all, we say, isn't the whole thing the Bible? But really, the understanding the relationship comes down to how we practice our faith. So we're going to listen to what the Belgic Confession says in Article 25 and then try to unpack that a little bit. Article 25. We believe that the ceremonies and symbols of the law have ended with the coming of Christ, and that all foreshadowings have come to an end, so that the use of them ought to be abolished among Christians. Yet the truth and substance of these things remain for us in Jesus Christ, in whom they have been fulfilled. Nevertheless, we continue to use the witnesses drawn from the law and the prophets to confirm us in the gospel, and to regulate our lives with full integrity for the glory of God, according to the will of God. Now, what this is saying, for example, is that the ceremonies that we find in the Old Testament, in Exodus and Leviticus, the sacrificial system, no longer holds sway for Christians. This creates a problem because sometimes Christians are accused of picking and choosing what we follow in the Bible. People will complain, for example, about the Christian view on some moral issue and then say in response, well, we don't believe that we have to make our clothes out of two different kinds of fabrics, and that's in the Bible too. And it is. We can read about that, for example, in Leviticus chapter 19, and there's lots of other similar laws. So we need an explanation for why we interpret the Bible the way we do, and how we live and witness the way that we do. There's an old saying that helps us understand the difference between the testaments. It goes like this: the new is in the old concealed, the old is in the new revealed. In other words, there's a difference between what the Old Testament and New Testament tell us, but it also explains that those two testaments ultimately reveal the same thing. The ceremonies and rules of the Old Testament prepare us for the kinds of things we need to know in order to meet God. It prepares us to understand His holiness, His majesty, His perfect righteousness. But the things that the Old Testament tells us cannot make it possible for us to know God until Jesus comes. But once Jesus is here, the foreshadowings, as the Belgic Confession puts it, the sacrificial system, the ceremonial law comes to an end, because the full picture of the way God has revealed His salvation to His people is now here. There's difference, in other words, but there's also continuity between the two testaments. Both reveal God's plan of salvation. The Bible is one big story, we believe. It's not two different stories, one for the Jews and one for the rest of us. It's the one story of salvation in which both Jews and others are brought into through Christ. And so the Old Testament still has a function for us, but it's a function that distinguishes between civil laws, like those about ancient Israelite government, ceremonial laws, like the ones about sacrifices, or two kinds of fabric, like we mentioned a minute ago, and moral laws, like adultery, murder, and worship. All of these laws, all of the things in the Old Testament, the law and the prophets, point us to Christ as the only mediator and intercessor. And that brings us to the next article of the Belgic Confession, Article 26, which talks about the intercession of Christ. This is really the big story of the Bible, the one story, the one thing that holds it all together. The story is that we are people who needed a way back to relationship with God after we had fallen into sin. Listen to what the confession says. We believe that we would have no access to God except through the one and only mediator and intercessor, Jesus Christ the righteous, who therefore was made human, uniting together the divine and human natures, so that we human beings might have access to the divine majesty. Otherwise, we would have no access. Now, I want to emphasize that last phrase for us. Otherwise, we would have no access to God. That's a pretty sobering thought. Maybe we really don't think about needing a mediator in our daily lives. We often think of ourselves as more or less good enough, invested enough in the things of this world to be of value to God. Our world affirms our self-esteem, which is not necessarily a bad thing, except that we can overemphasize that as well, coming to believe that we are really good enough to be in God's presence. But that's not how the Bible puts it. We were enemies when God reconciled us to Himself, Romans tells us. If you're an enemy, if you're at odds with someone, you need a mediator. You need someone to stand in between you and that other person in order to make things right. And that, the Bible says, is what Jesus does for us. Now, the fact that Jesus is human but also divine might intimidate us. But as the confession reminds us, neither in heaven nor among all the creatures on earth Is there anyone who loves us more than Jesus Christ does? What an amazing phrase. Neither in heaven nor among the creatures on earth does anyone love us more than Jesus. And the confession goes on to cite a number of Bible passages that remind us of Jesus' love. How Jesus, for example, was made like his brothers and sisters in every way. How he is able to sympathize with our weaknesses because he is like us in every way. The confession contrasts this power and love of Jesus with that of any other intercessor we could find. And in the context in which the confession was written, it was especially the Catholic saints, on whom many in their own day put their hope. The confession emphasizes that we don't offer prayers on the basis of our own worthiness or the worthiness of other human beings, but only on that of Jesus Christ. As the scriptures tell us, Jesus alone is able to save completely those who come to God through him, because he always lives to intercede for them. The emphasis, again, is on his death and his resurrection, on his ascension and reign. One of the things I think we've lost in our culture today is the sense that religion is a way of approaching God rather than simply a way of living well. And you can see this instantly if you go into a Catholic or Orthodox church. It's almost like you're walking into a different world. You feel like you've stepped into something different, and that compares to the casual way that we often approach worship today. And Protestant tradition, unfortunately, has a lot of kind of this casual notion. But we have to remember that no human being is in God's league. We're so used to waltzing into God's presence with our way of thinking about the world today that we forget how it is we actually get there. And it's really only when we run up against something that we can't solve, maybe an illness or a relational difficulty, a societal injustice, a sense of temptation or guilt that we feel, that we realize our need for God, that we realize that we need someone who can take us from the world that we inhabit and bring us into the holy and perfect presence of God. That is what the Christian faith is about. The gospel proclaims that God has come to us because we could not come to God. And so we need to recover a proper focus on Christ as the one who stands between us and God and restores us to a healthy confidence before God, not a fear, but also not an ignorance of the grace of God that brings us there. As we confess, we have no access to God apart from Christ. But we also confess that in him and through his blood, as part of his body, the church, which we'll discuss next time, we need never doubt that we are loved by the Maker of heaven and earth.